Arratsaldeon, ongi etorri. Buenas tardes. Vamos a comenzar con otra de las Brain Talks que, bueno, pues estamos haciendo para la ciudadanía cada vez que organizamos pues un evento científico importante. Y de nuevo pues nos encontramos aquí en el acuario gracias a la generosidad del equipo que lleva el acuario y de su presidente, que nos va pues a dar unas palabras de bienvenida, y a continuación pues daremos paso al profesor Gary Lupyan, que nos hablará pues de algo tan fascinante que les adelantaré dentro de unos minutos. Entonces, por favor, don Vicente Zaragüeta.
Bueno, Arratsaldeon, me encanta ver aquí a tanta juventud. Eso me encanta. A pesar que los viejos también tenemos mérito de colaborar con todos vosotros. Bueno, Arratsaldeon, buenas tardes. No le veo a mi buen amigo Gary Lupyan, ¿no? Lupyan, ¿dónde está? Bueno, y luego también a mi amigo Powell, que no le veo dónde está, pero sé que está aquí. Y le echamos muy en falta a Ana Fernández, que es una mujer extraordinaria y muy amiga de esta casa y mía. Bueno, antes que nada, quiero daros la bienvenida a este Aquarium de Donostia, un lugar que siempre ha acogido a todas las iniciativas orientadas al progreso y a la innovación. El Aquarium de Donostia, San Sebastián, y los que en él trabajamos, recibimos con satisfacción a cuantos trabajan por facilitar los vínculos de unión a las personas y a los pueblos. Es un honor para nosotros que nos hayáis elegido como sede para profundizar en vuestro esfuerzo por estudiar las circunstancias que diversificaron tanto la expresión lingüística de la humanidad, las raíces de los distintos y complicados idiomas que se separan, que se sepan a unos pueblos de otros. Ojalá el imparable proceso de evolución de la informática pueda llegar a algún modo de unificación de las lenguas para aumentar los lazos de unión entre quienes todavía las entienden como elemento separador y diferenciador. Las lenguas, cualquiera que sean las lenguas, son un patrimonio de la especie humana y por el hecho de existir ya enriquecen el espíritu y capacitan a la humanidad para comunicarse. Deseo fervientemente que vuestro trabajo sirva para hacer de esa comunicación un vínculo de unión, para que las palabras sean algo más que pura voz y transmitan sentimientos solidarios. En este fondo del mar en miniatura, que creo que no sé si lo habéis visto hace un momento, pero en fin, el acuario es el fondo del mar en miniatura, los peces no hablan, casi ni siquiera emiten sonidos perceptibles, pero les basta con sus miradas, sus movimientos y sus señales corporales para comunicarse con su entorno, para respetar y hacerse respetar sus espacios. El suyo es un lenguaje universal que saben interpretar entre ellos sin confusiones ni dobleces, ni dobles sentidos. En eso nos ganan. Y nada más, mis queridos amigos, que deseamos que sea un trabajo provechoso y una feliz estancia en esta casa. Eskerrik asko, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Vicente. Bueno, pues muchas gracias por venir acá. A pesar de que es un día, parece que bastante festivo y mucha gente pues está haciendo otras cosas. Hoy tenemos con nosotros al profesor Gary Lupyan de la Universidad de Wisconsin-Madison en Estados Unidos. Él realizó sus estudios en la Universidad de Cornell, luego pues fue a hacer la tesis doctoral con otro eminente científico, con Jay McClellan, que es un miembro de nuestro comité asesor, y hizo luego una estancia postdoctoral en la Universidad de Pensilvania con Sharon Thompson-Shield, y ahora pues está de profesor en la Universidad de Wisconsin-Madison. Y bueno, pues además de toda la investigación puntera que está haciendo, pues tiene otra serie de inquietudes, y una de ellas es el conocer un poquito más la diversidad de lenguas y por qué existen esas lenguas, y entonces hoy nos va a contar un poco pues sus experiencias y sus investigaciones sobre este pormenor. Sin más dilación, thank you for coming, and it's your turn. Now, hay traductores simultáneos para aquellos que lo necesiten. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'd like to leave as much time for questions as possible. So as I am speaking, if you have a question, if you really need to ask, please raise your hand, and I'm happy to pause and take the question. And if not, then please remember what you were going to ask, and there'll be time at the end, and I'm happy to have a discussion going. There should be enough time for that. The story I will try to tell is based on some work I've been doing with my friend and collaborator, Rick Dale, who's sitting right there. And what we set out to do is to try to answer a question that linguists have been puzzled over for a long time, and that people in general have been interested in for an even longer time. Why are there so many languages? And why are some at least seemingly so complicated, and others at least seemingly so relatively simple? One reason why people may have become interested, even in biblical times, about this question is that looking around, they might have seen that different people looked quite similar to one another, but they spoke languages that seemed to sound completely different and to be incomprehensible to people. So, people living in one village might speak a language that is quite different from people living in the village next door. And so, of course, we all know that languages sound differently. This is just a sense of how many languages there are in the world, between 6,000 and 7,000. And so here are some examples of languages, so you can hear how differently some of them sound. So this is
Jézus lecsendesíti a tengert. Ugyanezen a napon, amikor este lett, így szólt hozzájuk. Menjünk át a túlsó partra.
okay.
Miután tehát elbocsátották a sokaságot, magukkal vitték őt úgy, ahogy éppen a hajóban volt.
So some
De
of you
más
here
hajók is voltak a
might
nyomában.
recognize this
Ekkor nagy szélvihar.
as being Hungarian. Here's another language, sounds quite different. This is a language that was used by the United States during World War II by people speaking in code. So this is Navajo. And here's something that's even at least by sound, even more different. So this is a language spoken in South Africa, spoken by many people, about 8 million people. And what's different about this language is that it uses click sounds that to Western ears sound very strange, but that are used in many languages in Africa. Okay. So the first thing I will try to convince you of is that the differences between languages go beyond just these kinds of differences in how they sound, but go all the way down. And then I will try to answer this question of why might there be so many languages. And why are some so complicated? So if we look at different languages, so these are just some languages spoken in Europe, Indo-European languages, we can represent them in terms of these kinds of trees. And the farther back in time you go, so in the left, the farther back, the more similar the languages become. You might notice that Basque is not on here, and that is because it's, of course, not an Indo-European language. It's thought to be the last remaining pre-Indo-European language spoken in Western Europe. So it's quite special in that regard. Now, the normal answer to the question of why do these languages diversify, why do they become different, how do we go from Latin to all the Romance languages, to Spanish, French, Italian, is that at one time there is one community of people all communicating with each other. And then the groups spread apart. So Sapir says dialects arise, and then later languages arise, because two or more groups of individuals have become sufficiently disconnected to drift apart or independently instead of together. And he goes on to say, of course, it's impossible to have a language community that is spread over an area that is too vast. So the reason Latin diversifies is that it becomes spoken over too wide an area. And some communities are no longer speaking to other communities very much, and the language starts to diversify and to change. And so that kind of explanation is a non-functional explanation in that there's no particular reason why languages change in the way that they do. It simply has to do with where people live and the size of the community. The answer, the question why are languages different, we can think about this question in terms of animals, in biological organisms. Why are there different animals? And the answer there has been that, that animals adapt to their environments, right? And so the reason that these birds have these different beak shapes is not simply that they once all had the same beak, but then they moved apart and the beaks just happened to start all looking different. It's that they specialize in different kinds of diets. Some are aquatic birds, some are land birds, and the beak, the shape of the beak adapts to the environment the bird finds itself in. And so the suggestion is that languages are like animals, in that they both adapt to their environments. And so when we're talking about biological organisms, we can specify quite precisely what environment they are specializing in. So these are Galapagos finches, the birds that Darwin described in The Origin of the Species and studied. And we now know quite a lot about how differences, even very seemingly small differences, like what part of the tree a given bird species or subspecies inhabits, how that interacts with its physiology, and how the birds adapt to specialize in a particular environment. I just wanted to show you something just about how diversity of life. So here's another way of looking at all of life, not a tree in this case, but a circle, and those are humans over there. Okay. Now, when we look at animals, there was never much debate that animals are different from one another. Everyone can see that. And everyone can also, of course, hear that languages sound differently from one another. But in the field of linguistics, there has been a dogma for a long time that these differences are really superficial. It's a little like saying, well, sure, these fish, there's a large aquarium behind the screen. It looks something like this. Surely these fish all look different, but really they're all fish, so they're not different in any interesting way. And so this kind of thinking for a long time now has been applied to languages. And so the first thing, as I mentioned, that I hope to convince you of is that this is actually not true. Now, to tell the full story would take a long time, so let me just go through a few examples of just how difficult it is to find even one feature that all languages share. So for example, one might want to claim that all languages have verb and noun affixes. For example, in English, you combine the verb walk with the suffix ed to turn it into the past walked. Or in Spanish, we can make a noun plural, so add an s, go from gato to gatos. Right? But not all languages do this. Plenty of languages don't use any sorts of prefixes or suffixes. There has been a claim that all languages have what's called syntactic recursion, so the ability to say things like the mouse that was chased by the cat was really fast. But in fact, we now know there are exceptions. And so even in English or in Spanish, we can express this without using this kind of recursion. We can say, the mouse, it was chased by a cat. That mouse was fast. Right? And some languages do exactly this. Even the claim that all languages have nouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives, these classical categories, also turns out to not really hold. In a short story, Jorge Luis Borges has, so I included the Spanish translation there, imagines this alien language that doesn't have nouns and verbs, where everything is really, there's only one type of word. And I'll pause here so you can just read it. Okay, and so it turns out that there are, in fact, human languages that work like this. So this is a language that used to be fairly widespread in the Pacific Northwest, a North American indigenous language, Straight Salish. Right now, at the last count, which was 10 years ago, there were 20 remaining speakers. And in this language, there is no simple noun-verb distinction. So whether we're talking about events or entities or even proper names, the type of word is the same, but it just fits into a somewhat different slot. And so even here, something seemingly universal that all Indo-European languages, for example, have, is not true of all human languages. Even the claim that all languages have vowels and consonants, surely the building blocks of languages, also turns out to not be true. The clear exception is, of course, sign languages, which are full languages. They're languages just like spoken languages, but they don't have nouns and consonants. But even in the vocal domain, there are ways to communicate linguistically without using vowels and consonants. So this is actually a form of Spanish spoken on, or whistled on the Canary Islands, Silbo Gomero. Okay, and so what's happened here is over the centuries, the population to communicate over these long distances have adapted Spanish into this whistling language where there are types of whistles that correspond. Each whistle corresponds to several sounds in Spanish. And I'll talk a bit more about it in a little bit. But here's a language that's perfectly usable by people, that has no really vowels and consonants. Okay, so this idea is not quite right. Languages really are different, and we can next ask the question of why are they so different, and why are some so complicated? And so the simple answer to why are there so many languages, our claim is that it's the same as the answer to the question of why are there so many animals. And the reason is that there are lots of different environments, and there are lots of different ways for an animal to survive, and the form and the brain of the animal adapts to those different niches or environments. And we can see if that's also true of languages. And we're going to do this by seeing if languages spoken in particular environments have in some way adapted to those environments. Now, just how different in complexity are some languages? Well, consider the following example. In this example, we're going to talk about terms that are called deictics. So these are terms like this, that, here, there. Both English and Spanish have relatively very simple systems. But that's not true of all languages. So here's a language in which one needs to specify, as in English or Spanish, the field of the speaker. So are you talking about something here or something there? But there are many, many more distinctions. So you would use different forms of the word, whether you're talking about inside space or outside space, whether the this that you're talking about is up or down, whether it's close to the speaker or close to the listener. And there are also multiple cases and genders and so on. And so what you end up with are these very complex expressions that very precisely specify where something is without actually naming many objects. So the only noun here is kayak and just thing. But this term specifies quite precisely where that thing is with respect to the kayak. Okay, so if we count the words, English has 4 ways, 4 distinctions, whereas the language that we're concerned with here has 88 ways. Now, they're not arbitrary. In a particular situation, there are probably only a few different ways of expressing it, but you can see that there is an obvious difference in the level of complexity. Here's a much more mild example. Old English that eventually became modern English, so spoken about 1,000 years ago, used to have these words that specify, they're just different forms of the word where, and you would use one to talk about a location, and a different one to use direction. Okay? German still has this. English no longer has it, right? And so we can ask, why? What is it about the environment in which English was spoken that was different from the environment in which German was spoken that may have produced this kind of difference? One more general way of talking about complexity, and this is a certain kind of complexity in the language, is to talk about how complicated are the verbs, conjugating verbs. So in English, it's quite simple. There are really only 2 things you can do to a verb. You can make it turn it into a past tense, or you can conjugate it for agreement. So I go, he goes. Spanish is, of course, a bit more complicated, but not nearly as complicated as some languages. So this is Georgian. And if you were to try to compile lists of a particular form of the word, these are just some of them, right? So compared to, say, Latin, this is much, much more elaborate. Okay. And in addition to all of these different ways of changing the word to agree with the speaker and so on, there are also there's this class of prefixes that change the meaning of the verb quite radically. So the root, the infinitive, is this QR, but if you prefix it with da, it means one thing. If you prefix it with she, it means something different, and so on. Okay. So this is a very different way of doing it than, say, English or Spanish. Many linguists have found it useful to talk about a kind of continuum between analytic or isolating languages on one side and polysynthetic languages on the other. Okay, and this is only one way of cutting the space, but it's one that's quite useful. And so on the left side are many of the languages that we're familiar with. On the right side are languages like the Inuit language that I mentioned, with the different ways of saying this and that. And here's another example. Another Native American language that used to be spoken in upstate New York, Cayuga, in which whole sentences become embedded into a single word. Okay, so this is quite common for languages that are on this right side. Okay. So now we're ready to ask the specific question of whether these differences are in some way related to the environment in which the languages are spoken. Just like we can understand something about why the beaks of these birds look the way they do based on studying the environments in which the birds live, maybe we can understand why languages differ in the ways that they do by looking at the environments in which they're spoken. And so that's a very big question, and so what I'll show you are just the initial studies we've done to start understanding it. One thing that will be useful in answering this question is trying to understand what does it mean to talk about an environment in which a language is spoken. So we can look at a particular bird or fish and see, okay, does it live in salt water or fresh water? Does the bird eat nuts or fruits? So what sorts of factors are important when we look at linguistic environments? One factor we looked at is population. How many people speak a language? So this is something that there are languages spoken by very few people. There are languages spoken by many people. People are surprised to learn that half of the world's languages are only spoken by fewer than 7,000 people. Okay, so there are about between 6,000 and 7,000 languages in the world. Half of them have fewer than 7,000 speakers. Okay, so in comparison, Basque is spoken by about 600,000. So that's not very many, but much more than 7,000. And half of the world's languages are spoken over an area of about 950 square kilometers. That's about the size of Luxembourg. Okay, so when we think about a language like Spanish or English or Mandarin Chinese, this is not the norm. The norm is something like this. So this is a bit of Papua New Guinea, one of the most linguistically diverse environments in the world. And these are, based on the data we got, the language boundaries. And so you can see just how linguistically diverse this area is. Now, the languages that neighbor each other tend to be quite related. They're not completely different, but it doesn't take much to go from one area to another to end up in a place where the language is radically different. Okay, and so to test this idea that languages adapt to what we call the cultural ecology or the linguistic niche, we found it useful to think about how is how are languages spoken by few people versus many people learned and used? Okay? And so all languages have to be learnable, right? We can't have an unlearnable language because it just wouldn't be passed on to the next generation. All languages have to be learnable by infants, right? There are exceptions. There are made-up languages. So, for instance, there is Klingon in Star Trek. There is Esperanto. And interestingly, there's been some work showing what happens when infants learn Esperanto. So, but normally, all languages are learned by infants. So there's the usual language learner. But only some languages are learned by adults. Okay. So there is a very strong constraint on languages to have forms that are learnable by these guys, but only some languages have ever been learned by adults, right? We can look at some numbers. So here are population sizes of a few languages, looking at the number of native speakers and non-native speakers. Okay, so Abkhaz has about 110,000, and about 95% of those are native speakers. Japanese is an interesting case because it has many, many speakers, something like 120 million. I think that's probably too high, but about 99% are native speakers. And for languages like Yupik Eskimo, there are very, very few speakers, and the only non-native speaker might be one or two linguists who try to learn the language to write its grammar. The story is very different for other languages, so English, Malay, Swahili. English has about, it's hard to estimate these numbers, but about 400 million native speakers, and depending on how you count, many more non-native speakers. And in all, about the estimates that I've seen are that about 70% of speakers of English are not native speakers. And that's not the most extreme. So Swahili, in Swahili only about 10% are native speakers, because it's used much more widely as a kind of a lingua franca, and there's a core group only that use it as their really primary native language. Okay, so many languages look like this, and some languages look like this. So these are, in red, are countries in which English is a dominant language. So we can ask, does it matter? Is it the case that languages that are learned by many people have grammars that over time have become different? Okay, now there are lots of examples of people having trouble with English just because so many are learning it. So, and here's another example in China. Okay, but the reason you get this is that there are so many people learning English. That's not the case for most of the world's languages. Okay, and so we can ask whether, first question is whether there is some relationship between this kind of difference in grammar and the difference, and we're calling it here, I'm using these words, exoteric and esoteric. So languages on the right tend to have fewer speakers. They're spoken over smaller areas, and there's generally more social cohesion. So think about this factor in the following way. If all you know is that someone speaks English, you really can't tell very much about them. They could be from anywhere in the world. there's really, because all kinds of people speak English, if you know that someone speaks Basque, there is much more you can tell. And so on this end, we have cases of people speaking more or less the same language over very diverse environments. And there is not much you can know about them just from knowing what language they speak. Okay. And so the question we asked, the hypothesis we put forward, is whether there is this relationship between social structure, who learns the language, who uses the language, and grammatical structure. And we predicted that languages with more speakers and those that are used by more diverse communities have adapted to this niche. They adapted in a cultural way, just as birds adapt biologically through natural selection to their physical environments, so languages adapt culturally to their social environments. And to test this hypothesis, we used a resource that became available relatively recently called WALS, the World Atlas of Language Structures, which combines information from hundreds and hundreds of historic linguists, of descriptive linguists over thousands of languages, pools the information together, and allows us to run quantitative analyses on these data. And so the first question we asked was whether this variable that I mentioned earlier of verb morphology correlates with features like population and the size over which a language is spoken. So in this variable, English would get a score of 2, Georgian would get a score of 9. Okay, and Spanish is about 4. Okay. And so here's the data from WALS, and you can see that geographically there are differences. So languages in Europe, for example, tend to, these white marks correspond to more simple verb morphology. And if we do the analyses, we get a very strong relationship. So those are just some sample languages that are in these categories. There were many more languages included. And we see that languages that have more complex verbs tend to be spoken by fewer people. Or conversely, languages that are spoken by many, many people over wide areas tend to be, in this respect, simpler. We've analyzed this in a number of ways. We can, instead of individual languages, also look at language families, and we get similar relationships. So groups of languages, so now all Indo-European languages are just collapsed into a single point. And as part of this work, we looked at other aspects of languages. For example, possession, evidentiality, tense, and I'll give you just a flavor of some of these analyses. Because they also point out just interesting ways in which languages differ. So possession refers to sentences like the girl's ice cream. So it's what does a language do to signal that the ice cream belongs to the girl? So English does this apostrophe S, or you can also say the ice cream of the girl, but this is the normal way of saying it. But there are other types of possession. Right? Say my brother, my hand. You can refer to the country's population. Right? Things like that. And some languages distinguish these kinds of types of possession. So they do different grammatical things to mark them. So here's one example. A distinction that a number of languages make is between alienable and inalienable possession. So if you say my milk in English, it's ambiguous. Do you mean my milk, the milk that I bought, or my breast milk? right? So something that's part of your body. You can specify this, of course, in English if you need to, but other languages force the speaker to make this distinction. It cannot be left unsaid. And so when we look to see whether this is related to factors like population, we find that indeed it is, such that languages spoken by more people tend to have simpler ways of expressing possession. This doesn't mean there's no way to talk about it, of course. You can disambiguate, you can specify, but it's not part of the grammar. We can look at the future tense, so that's quite simple. How do you express that something will happen in the future? Some languages do it using the grammar, other languages do it using separate words. So I can say, tomorrow I go, right? So you can use some word to signal that it's going to happen in the future. Other languages do it in the grammar, and again, we see a difference, so that languages that use a grammatical way of expressing it, where it's really built into the language, tend to have fewer speakers. Languages that have more speakers do it, either omit it entirely, or you have to use separate words. So the final example is evidentiality. And this is quite interesting. This refers to ways of signaling how you've come to know something. So instead of saying, I know that the earth is round, you have to specify how you've come to know this. Is this something that you were told? Is this something that you figured out yourself? Is it something that's just common sense? Did you see it yourself? And so different languages have very specific ways of marking this. Whether, for instance, if you say the motor roared, right? Is it something you heard yourself, or is it something that you were told? There are also these kinds of evidentials, and there's something interesting happening with English right now where it's quite cumbersome to say, my friend told me this, or my friend said this, and then my other friend said this. And so in English, people are starting to use like as this kind of marker. So they say, instead of my friend said, they say my friend was like, and then they say a quote. And so like is being used as what's called a quotative, but some languages really use it in a grammatical way. Okay, and again, we see this difference. Languages that build it into the grammar tend to be the smaller languages. If we put it all together, put all of these factors, combine them into kind of one score, we get this relationship so that the more people there are speaking a language, the simpler it becomes. Okay. Now, we can ask the question of why is there so much complexity to begin with? So the story about why languages get simpler is that there are certain things that adults find difficult to learn, and they have an impact over time on the language. And the things that are difficult for adults to learn drop out. If a language is never learned by adults, it keeps those things. But why are they there in the first place? So why don't we all speak languages like English or Mandarin or Lao that are quite simple in terms of their morphology, parts of the grammar? And one answer we just started to explore is that maybe this complexity actually helps children to learn the language. And so the idea here is that these languages that have more complexity, it's complex for adults, but it actually may help children because it increases redundancy. And so here's an example from another language in the Pacific Northwest that takes grammatical gender to a new level. So we have a sentence, this is the sentence, the woman put a lot of sand on the large table. The grammatical gender is expressed on every word and multiple times. So for instance, in this one sentence, that table is masculine is repeated 3 times. And the idea is that for these guys, this is just complicated and unnecessary. But for infants learning the language, it may help to ground the language in the environment. And to see whether this is actually true, whether, first of all, languages, for instance, spoken by more people, are somehow more ambiguous, less determined. We took a document that's been translated into over 100 languages and just looked to see, are the translations in some languages more redundant? Do they contain multiple information kind of marked multiple times? And so one very simple, and it turns out powerful way of looking at this is to take this text, Declaration of Human Rights, we have it over 100 languages, and then use just program to zip the file. So you've probably all done this on your computers. Just zip the file, okay? And what zipping does is it takes out much of the redundancy, just that's in the words of the language. So if you have a case marker or a gender marker marked in all these words, then you only need to represent it once, and then you just take out all the rest. And so it turned out that indeed languages spoken, again, by more people were less redundant. And this may be a good thing, again, for adults, but it may make it more difficult to initially learn by kids. And so this is an empirical prediction. We need to actually test whether this is true, whether kids find certain aspects of languages like English particularly difficult to learn. So in becoming more easily learnable by adults, English may have become somewhat more difficult or require special training to be learned to a proficient degree by kids. So this is something we're looking at now. Okay. The last thing I'll talk about just for a few minutes is another aspect of the language environment, and that's actually the physical environment. And so we return to the Canary Islands. And
to announce celebrations and funerals, romarias or pilgrimages, weddings and baptisms. It is not a language created for the intimate. It is for the public, for what must be said out loud and can be heard by all.
Okay, so as you can see, it's not a coincidence that this kind of whistling form of language arose in this environment. It arose for a specific purpose, and it arose because the Canary Islands have an environment like this with valleys, and because of the kind of agriculture that was being practiced, people had to communicate over long distances. That's not true of environments like this. So this is the city where I live now, Madison. There are no valleys. You don't need to scream over the hills so that someone can hear you. People talk on phones. So we can ask the question of whether the physical environment bears some relationship onto a language. And so here's another kind of environment. And we can imagine what might be necessary to communicate where something is. So to say that, can you run over to that rock? Well, there might be lots of rocks scattered around. How would you know which one? And so as it happens, languages that have these kinds of systems tend to be spoken in places like this. And languages that are spoken in places like this, where there are lots of objects, there are streets and houses, and you can say things like, it's across the street, right? Or it's next to the house, right? Whereas you can't do that here. And so there hasn't been much research done on this, but it's an interesting avenue of future research. Whether the degree to which the environment has been shaped by people interacts in interesting ways with the grammar of the language. One final interesting, perhaps, example. An area where there has been more research is in systems, also to indicate where something is, but on a larger scale. And these systems are, of course, used for navigation. So we can say things like turn right, or we can say turn north, okay? And it turns out that they, too, interact in an interesting way with the environment in which a language is spoken. Now, when we turn to other animals, we find remarkable systems of navigation. So this is a homing pigeon, and when it was taken and had a hood placed over its head and transported 66 kilometers without seeing where it's going, and then just let loose, they all find their way home, but they, not only that, but they initially tend to fly in the direction that's in the direction of home. So they have these built-in systems for navigation, for sensing the Earth's magnetic fields. How do people do? Well, so these data I'm about to show you is from a group of British hikers who walked 1 kilometer on a trail in the forest and then told, okay, which way is back where you started? Which way is home? And so that's their data. Okay? Here's what happens when you disorient someone. Not everyone.
Spin him more.
Most people would hopefully do better.
All right, nobody tell him. Behind you.
Calm down. Don't run. I'm backing up. Backing up, backing up, backing up. With my mind.
Okay. Now it turns out that there are people who are quite good at these kinds of tasks. So here's a group of Australian Aborigines in the desert in Australia, pointing to various distances, some of which were 300 kilometers away. So pointing to where, in the direction of a city, pointing to in the direction of a water well, and so on. Okay. Here's another group. Okay, this is a group of African Bushmen. Okay. So distances hundreds of kilometers away, and just for comparison, here's a British sample. Okay, it turns out that, of course, the environment that these people live in is quite different, but their language is different as well. So in most of the languages we're familiar with, if you wanted to say where the fork is to the left of the plate. But there are quite a few languages, by some estimations about a third of the world's languages, where you would not use terms like left and right, which are based on your body. But instead you would use a term like uphill, downhill, or north-south that is based on the external environment. And if we look to see where these kinds of languages are spoken, so the one that was studied perhaps the most is Tenehap Mayan. And this language is spoken in a particular area, and most of the land is on a slant. And people use this not just to talk about where things are outside, but also for things inside their homes. So they would say that the fork is uphill of the plate. Here's another kind of system. And in addition, often these systems have complex terms for different parts of the environment. Now, this kind of system is not useful in an environment like this. Okay? But it is quite useful in an environment like this, right? So in the Himalayas, many of the languages spoken make reference to the mountains just because they're ever present, they're always there, and even though they may not be seen inside the home, people always know where they are. And so the idea is that this provides a kind of training where using this language makes everyone into a good navigator. We don't need these languages to become good navigators. If you're learning to fly planes or sail or navigate through forests, you can become quite good, and you end up actually using a system like this. But in a language like this, everyone, just to say where the fork is, has to become, in fact, an expert navigator. So this is just a story about, a lot of this work was done by Steve Levinson at the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen. And this is from a book where they tell a story about trying to disorient someone, a Mayan in Mexico. Okay, and so that's quite different from the guy trying to hit the piñata. Okay. So to conclude, we've shown some data that the grammar of languages is not just randomly varying, but related to the social and environmental factors in which the language is spoken. These environments are changing. So here's an interesting fact. The idea is that particular languages may help us cope with specific environments. There are 300 million people reportedly learning English in China. That's about the population of the US. And so we can ask how such an influx of non-native speakers might, in time, change the language. English is a very unique language in that throughout its history, even before the British Empire, even before, it was used by a very diverse group of people because of the various invaders coming to the British Isles. That's not the case for most of the world's languages. And so we are constantly running these kinds of natural experiments. So here's an interesting animation of the change in the Iberian Peninsula of languages over time. Right? And so historical linguists have data on how these languages changed over the time, but we can now start looking to see how these changes may be related to these kinds of transitions where Castilian at one point spoken by relatively few people, then it expands, and it's now spoken by a more diverse group of people. Basque contracts and is spoken by a more cohesive, perhaps, but smaller group of people. And if language helps us cope with our environment, helps us to learn about things like navigating, we can see how that interacts with the change and who speaks the language. So I'll close with this quote by John Hayes, who says that the use of language cannot change reality, but it can change the perception of reality. Parents bringing up offspring can use language to mold the cognitive structure of children in ways that promote survival. And this process becomes one of structuring perception by using the acquisition of vocabulary and grammar to modify perceptual categorization. In most of the work I do, I actually look at how language structures cognitive and perceptual systems, and it seems from some of these experiments that the effects are quite deep. Language can literally change how we see. And then the question is, how might different languages change this as well? How do they make us the people that we are? Thank you.
Thank you very much for, for the exciting talk. Bueno, ahora tenemos un tiempo para preguntas, si alguien quiere preguntar algo sobre esta charla tan provocativa. Sí, ahora un micrófono. Are you gonna get the... Yeah?
Pues, should I speak to him in English or in Spanish or?
Either way, I don't know whether they si habla en inglés, ¿la traductora lo oye o no? ¿Sí? Venga. En lo que quiera.
No, simply to say that it was provocative indeed, and there are 7 or 8 or 10 different subjects that could be mentioned. But one of them, and to start with, would be why people tend to talk so much about the differences in languages, and so little about the similarities in the different languages, because they are, no matter how different they can be. What Chomsky said about the Martian scientist who thinks we only speak one language on Earth, you have erased it as non-valid, but I think it is very valid. And we are really, in no matter what language, we are only talking about people, me, you, them. We are talking about time, tomorrow, yesterday. We are talking about objects, things. And this is all immersed in a magma of grammar, to use a word, grammar, which is singular, plural, masculine, feminine. In practically each language will do it in a different way, but we will do it. Oh, sorry.
Thank you for the question. Indeed, most research in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, has focused on the similarity of languages. Before Chomsky, there was more interest in describing the differences, but under his influence, many people have started to assume that these differences don't matter. And it's true what you say, that we're all human and we tend to talk about very similar things. But I think that's what makes it so interesting, because even though on some abstract level there are indeed similarities, people in different communities, in different cultures, have come up with different solutions to these same problems. So everywhere we have to talk about what someone did. Everywhere we have to find ways to get food and to communicate this information to the next generation. But the precise ways, unlike most other animals that that have complicated communication systems, but they're very fixed and rigid, language allows us to develop really any kind of system, any kind of culture. It's incredibly flexible. But it seems that different languages have chosen to specialize in somewhat different things. This does not, of course, make one language better than another in any way. But in looking at the differences and in looking how they relate to the environments, I think we can learn really about how different cultures have converged on solutions to common problems, but in somewhat different ways. And so we can, I think, learn about the human capacities. If people didn't go into these communities and study these languages, many might assume that it was, as an English speaker, impossible to do these kinds of navigation tasks. Only if you were some real expert, a sailor, navigator, people would have no idea that in these cultures, little kids can do this quite well. And so we can, I think by thinking of language as a kind of technology that trains us in a particular way, we can learn more about our capacities and also limitations.
Bueno, no sé, igual se está comprobando si, por ejemplo, esas lenguas que no tienen deixis, que son tan concretas, que parece que si los nombres pululan al infinito, o sea, tienen un pensamiento más concreto. Quizá el que una lengua se hable por mucha gente y se simplifique su gramática puede permitir organizaciones más complejas y un pensamiento más abstracto.
I think it's possible, but it's a difficult question to answer because, of course, people who speak particular languages are also embedded in a given environment. And so languages, for instance, that have no or very few number words, we can ask what effect does it have on the ability of the speakers to do mathematics? And it seems to have a detrimental effect. But that's not a problem for those individuals because in their community they don't need to do much formal mathematics. If that community were to develop a need to do mathematics over time, the language would change. But in the answer to your question is yes, perhaps, but one really has to do careful studies to really get at the specifics. Many people, the history of looking at language changes, unfortunately, has been fairly ugly in that, for instance, during colonization of the New World, people saw these, heard these indigenous Native American languages and made judgments about the cognitive capacities of people who spoke those languages. And actually, they realized that these languages seem to be more complex, but they, and people have written on this, that they perhaps are not abstract enough. One cannot do philosophy in these languages or something like this. And that's not necessarily true, but if languages train our brain, train our cognitive systems, there may be costs and benefits to learning a particular system. And we're only starting to understand how these are related to each other. So just at the beginning, really.
Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you for the. Thank you for the interesting talk. And the whole time I was thinking about how you would define language, and of course we know that it's a really difficult question. And one point that you said that in the middle of your talk is that a language should be learnable to a child. And in the case of Silbo Gomero, I mean, I'm not familiar with this whistling language, but I wondered, is it really considered language? Would children, infants, actually be able to segment those whistles into reasonable chunks? And how limited is that language, if you call it language, to just certain messages that are very important for conveying, like come home, or dinner is done, or whatever?
Right. Absolutely. So the whistling kind of language is, as far as I know, there's no child who only speaks that. So it's actually more like a very limited dialect of Spanish, used for a very specific purpose. But it seems that any system that has to take the role of a full language, almost by definition, has to be learnable by infants. So whether it's sign language or actually written language as well, because written languages are also constrained by those very same factors. Now, of course, written languages are not learned spontaneously. They have to be taught. But that raises the interesting question of how actually people have assumed that all languages are learned by kids equally quickly. But we don't know this to be the case. And it may be that, we know that the amount of speech directed at children in different cultures varies very dramatically. In some cultures, parents and adults speak to children all the time. In other cultures, it's not really done. Kids talk to other kids, and kids, of course, hear adults speak, but adults very rarely speak to the children directly. And so one hypothesis we'd like to investigate, it's an interesting idea, it's just speculation, is that the reason that kids in these cultures, where their kids are not really spoken to very much, the reason they can learn the language, nevertheless, may have something to do with the grammar of the language. And if it was English they were trying to learn, for example, they would not do very well. So there's now a lot of work in the US looking at differences in how much parents speak to the children within the US, and even relatively small decreases in child-directed speech have quite serious effects on, for instance, how the child does in school, and how much language how fluent they are, for instance, at 4 or 5. So it may be that English is very sensitive to this, but other languages that have more grounded and more specific grammatical devices may buffer the language from these kinds of effects. It's really speculation, but it's an interesting hypothesis to explore.
May I follow up on that question? I mean, the reason why I asked is that I always believed and still believe that at least one universal, I mean, I don't believe there are many, but at least one for spoken languages is that all spoken languages have vowels and consonants. So I wonder whether this whistling system would be really considered as a language, especially if it is not learnable. And the other thing is that that even sign languages have a structure that could be basically put in syllables or in structure that is similar to vowels and consonants. So you know that's one, at least one kind of almost a universal that I believe is pointing to similarities between the languages, as the first question was.
No, that may well be the case. One interesting relationship that some people are now starting to look at, Dan Dediu at the Max Planck Institute just got a grant to look at whether there are differences between groups in throat morphology. And these differences may make certain consonants easier to pronounce by some people. And the question is whether languages that use these consonants tend to be spoken by people who have throats that make it easier to produce those sounds. And so I'm not sure whether it's the case that someone who doesn't have that kind of throat can't learn the language, but all it takes is a very slight difference to show for there to be these effects. And so that's another way of, and there it's not saying that some sounds are better than others, again, but that the reason languages sound differently may have something to do with actually physiological differences between populations. And I think it's useful to know this, to understand why languages differ in the ways that they do. But of course, we in some way, we really have similar bodies, we have similar vocal apparatus, and consonants and vowels in a way are maybe just the most effective way. You know, there may be other ways, but using these sorts of speech sounds may just be the most effective way for spoken languages to exist. So yes.
Sí. A ver, yo quería preguntar si todos los idiomas los niños los aprenden a la misma edad, o sea, dominan el lenguaje, independientemente de lo gramáticamente complicados que son. Es decir, con 4 años o con 5 años, la media de los niños hablan bien castellano, ¿siempre es a la misma edad o depende del lenguaje?
It seems that in a general way, when people have looked at it, the answer is yes, although certain aspects of the grammar may not be learned until later. So in some languages, it's quite common for 10-year-olds to make certain kinds of mistakes, and it's normal, you know. But what's really unknown, because no one has ever looked at it, is whether getting a 5-year-old to that level takes more work, takes more input in some languages than others. We know that there are differences in how much language kids get, how much they're spoken to, but we don't know if it's related to the grammar. So it may be that there's no amount of input that will get a 6-month-old talking, right? So there is a limit, and even with very little input, a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old will speak quite well. But when you get to a 3-year-old, well, then if the 3-year-old is learning one language, they may require more input, more direct input, not just watching TV, than an infant or child learning another language. And we just don't know. It's possible, but we don't know.
Thank you.
Last, just a very, very quick comment on your question. There is, I don't know whether this is published already, but it was a couple of years ago, I saw a Danish researcher trying to answer exactly this question, where she looked at how children acquire language and how quickly over time they get at, producing just simple phrases. And it seemed to be dependent on the phonological structure of a language. So it turns out that the Danish children were very late compared to all the other children, because they have so many vowels in their speech input, which is very hard for the children to segment, so to find the words. And so they were a little bit delayed as compared to the other kids that they had. But I don't know whether it's published, and maybe there is more about, but there was some difference there.
Thank you.
Now, voy a hablar en español. ¿Cómo explica usted el milagro de que una frase sencilla como no te la daré mañana, tú me has pedido algo y yo te digo no te la daré mañana, esta frase, I won't give it to you tomorrow, it has got 2,500 varieties. Only one is correct, and children at the age of 4 or 5 can pronounce, utter. They know these sentences and can use them perfectly. I won't give it to you tomorrow, in contrast with she didn't give it to me yesterday, or I am not going to give them to him, or whatever.
And so, I'm sorry, the question is why?
Yeah, how is it possible? And how don't we wonder all the time at the miracle of being able to use, to sort out a problem like that, where we've got to make a choice out of 2,500,
yeah,
and only one is possible, to produce a very short sentence like, did you give it to him?
Mm-hmm. Well, one answer, so this gets complicated, one answer is that those possible combinations are not all equally heard by the child. They're not all equally likely statistically. And it's of course not the case that children just mimic what they hear. But it is the case that children's initial uses of utterances don't mean what the adult would mean by them. So when a child, when a 2-year-old says, can you wait 5 minutes? They might not know what 5, they might not be able to give you 5 pencils. They know that 5 refers to something about number, and they know that minutes refers to something about time, maybe. But they also use it quite instrumentally. They mean, if you say 5 minutes, your mom leaves you alone for a little bit. And of course, it is amazing how quickly kids master language. But one also has to keep in mind that languages have the structure that they do because if they didn't, kids wouldn't master them and those languages wouldn't exist. So if something was very, very confusing, kids would learn something, and that over time would become the way the language works. And also, there are many, many confusing things in language. We don't always understand each other. Languages are not perfect, they're not unambiguous, and that's mostly okay. Many times we don't even realize that we misunderstood someone, but in the worst case, you can ask them to clarify. You can say, can you repeat that? And this happens quite a bit, and I think that's in part what makes language so fluent and usable.